Her husband's family rented out her beach house, unaware the deed was in her name.
Your Honor, this certified deed proves rightful ownership.
Let me take it from the beginning. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a marriage in its comfortable years. Not silence exactly, but a rhythm so familiar that neither person notices when a single beat starts to fall out of time. Jola Okafor had lived inside that rhythm for 11 years. She would not have called her marriage perfect. She would have called it steady, and for a long time, steady had felt like enough. She was 38 years old, the founder of a small but respected home staging studio in the city, the kind of business built one referral at a time rather than one lucky break. Her calendar was full of walkthroughs and client calls. Her car perpetually smelled of fresh paint samples, and her hands had the particular roughness of a woman who still liked to move furniture herself when a room needed convincing rather than decorating. She had built that business from nothing in the years before she met Jeremiah, and she had bought the beach house the same way, slowly, deliberately, without asking anyone's permission. The house sat on a quiet stretch of Solmar Bay, weathered cedar shingles gone silver gray from salt air, a wraparound porch just wide enough for 2 chairs, and a coffee table that never quite stayed level. She had purchased it 9 years earlier, back when the block was still considered a little too far from the boardwalk to be fashionable, back when she was 29 and single and had just closed the best year her business had ever had. It was not a mansion. It was 3 bedrooms and a view that turned gold every evening around 6, and it was hers, in the particular way that only a thing bought entirely with your own money can belong to you. She met Jeremiah the following spring, at a wedding neither of them had wanted to attend alone. He was easy to like, patient in a way that read as strength before she understood. It was sometimes avoidance wearing strength's clothes. He worked in freight logistics, ran a modest trucking company he'd inherited half interest in from his father, and he had a habit of listening to her talk about paint finishes and load-bearing walls with genuine attention, which she had not expected from a man who spent his days thinking about shipping routes. They married 2 years later, in a small ceremony on the porch of the beach house itself, her mother's pearl earrings borrowed for the occasion, Jeremiah's hand trembling slightly when he read his vows. She remembered thinking, watching him fumble the page, that she had found someone who was nervous in all the right ways. His family had liked the house from the beginning. That was not a warning sign. Families are supposed to like the places where good things happen. Jeremiah's mother, Deborah, had spent that wedding weekend walking the property with the proprietary pleasure of a woman inspecting something she approved of, remarking more than once on what a shame it would be to let such a beautiful place sit empty most of the year. Jola had laughed it off then. She had let the family use the house twice in the early years, once for Deborah's 60th birthday, once for a cousin's baby shower, and both times she had felt generous doing it, the way you feel generous opening your home to people you are trying to love well. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early spring when the first strange thing happened, and it happened in the most ordinary way imaginable. A text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Hi Jola, just wanted to say thank you again for letting us stay at the Solmar house last weekend. My husband said it was the best anniversary trip we've had in years." The little note about the outdoor shower was so helpful, lol. Hope to book again in the fall. She read it twice, standing in her kitchen with a mug of coffee going cold in her hand, waiting for the message to resolve itself into something that made sense. She did not know this woman. She had not been at the beach house last weekend. She had not written a note about the outdoor shower, because she did not know there was anything worth explaining about the outdoor shower. She typed back carefully, "I think you might have the wrong number. I don't believe we've spoken before. Can I ask where you got this contact?" The reply came quickly, cheerful and unbothered. "Oh, sorry. This was the number listed for the property manager on the booking site. Everything was wonderful. Just wanted to say thanks." Property manager, booking site. Jola set the mug down. There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives instead disguised as a compliment from a stranger, a thank you note meant for someone else, an ordinary Tuesday interrupted by a single sentence that does not fit anywhere in the life you believed you were living. Most people do not recognize it in the moment. They read it twice, set it aside, decide it must be a misunderstanding, and go on with their evening, because the alternative is too large to hold standing in a kitchen with cold coffee in your hand. It is only later, once the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, that anyone looks back and marks that ordinary Tuesday as the beginning of everything. If you're the kind of viewer who finds yourself replaying a moment like that, the one small detail that didn't add up before the whole truth came apart, you already know why stories like this one exist. Milan Folktales was built for exactly this feeling, the slow, quiet unraveling of a family's secrets, one thread at a time. If that's the kind of story you came for, stay close. This one has more threads than most. She did not call Jeremiah that night. She told herself it was because he was traveling for work, out at a logistics conference 2 states away, and that whatever this was could wait until he was home to help her make sense of it. The truth, which she would only admit to herself much later, was that some quiet, self-protective part of her already suspected the explanation would not be simple, and she wanted one more night of not knowing before she had to know. Instead, she called her business partner, Miranda, who had known her since design school and had a gift for asking the one question that cut straight to the center of a problem. "You said property manager," Miranda repeated, when Jola read her the text. "You don't have a property manager. I don't have a property manager. So who's answering as one?" That was the question, wasn't it? Jola spent the rest of that evening doing the thing she was good at professionally and had never once thought to do personally. She searched. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. A listing on a vacation rental site, photographs of her own porch and her own kitchen, and her own guest bedroom with the quilt her grandmother had made folded at the foot of the bed, all of it captioned in cheerful, breezy language that was not hers. Charming coastal retreat, family-owned and lovingly maintained. 4.5 stars, 23 reviews going back 14 months. 14 months. She scrolled through the reviews with the particular nausea of watching strangers narrate a version of her own life. Guests thanked the family for their hospitality. One review mentioned meeting Luke at check-in, who had been kind enough to explain the quirks of the water heater. Another thanked Chloe for her quick response when they'd locked themselves out. A third, from 6 months earlier, mentioned that the sweet older lady who does the linens had left a bottle of wine on the counter as a welcome gift. Jola did not know who had been in her house. She knew, with sudden and total certainty, that her house had not been empty nearly as often as she believed. Jeremiah came home 3 days later, tired from travel, unaware that anything in his marriage had shifted while he was gone. Jola had spent those 3 days doing what she did best in her professional life, and had never once turned toward her own family, gathering information quietly, without alerting anyone that she was gathering it. She had screenshots of the listing. She had a folder of reviews with dates. She had not yet told Miranda everything she suspected, because some part of her still needed it to be a misunderstanding, still needed there to be an innocent explanation, waiting on the other side of an honest conversation. She showed him the listing on his second night home, after dinner, the dishes still in the sink between them. She watched his face carefully. She had learned, over 11 years, to read the particular way he went still when he was deciding how much to say. "That's not what it looks like," he said, which was, she would come to understand, one of the least reassuring sentences a person can say. "What does it look like?" "My mom's been using the house sometimes, when it's empty. She didn't want to bother you about every little weekend, so it's not empty most weekends, Jeremiah. There are 23 reviews. There's an outdoor shower note. There's a woman named Chloe answering guest questions. Who is renting out my house?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she recognized from a decade of watching him avoid his mother's calls, avoid disagreements at family dinners, avoid anything that required him to stand somewhere firm. "I think my mom set something up with Luke to help cover costs when the family used it. I didn't know it had gotten this organized." "You didn't know, or you didn't ask?" He didn't answer that, and the silence told her more than any answer would have. The conversation with Deborah, when it finally happened the following weekend, took place in Deborah's own kitchen, over tea that nobody drank. Deborah was 62, elegant in the unhurried way of a woman who had spent her life being listened to, and she received Jola's questions not with guilt, but with something closer to mild confusion, the expression of a person being asked to justify something she had never once considered needed justifying. "We've always used that house, Jola," she said, "since before you and Jeremiah were even married properly. I don't understand what's changed." "What's changed is that I found out strangers have been staying there for over a year, and I never gave anyone permission to rent it out." "Nobody's renting it, exactly. Luke set up a little listing so the family could offset the cost of keeping it up. The cleaning, the lawn service, all of that. It's family money going toward a family house." "It's not a family house. It's my house. My name is on the deed." Deborah's expression did not change so much as settle, the way a person's face settles when they have decided a conversation isn't worth the energy of disagreement. "Your husband's family has always understood it as ours to use. That's simply how things have been." How things have been was not the same as how things were supposed to be, but Jola did not say that yet. She was beginning to understand, in the careful, methodical way she approached every difficult client, every impossible renovation, that this was not a conversation she was going to win across a kitchen table. This was a conversation she was going to need documents for. Luke, when she finally reached him directly, was defensive in a different register than his mother's calm entitlement. Younger, quicker to anger, the particular anger of someone who suspects, somewhere beneath the surface, that he has done something he shouldn't have. He told her the listing had been Chloe's idea originally, that he'd only handled the online calendar because he was better with that stuff, that the money from bookings went into a shared account for house expenses that he did not, when pressed, seem eager to itemize. Chloe, for her part, was the easiest to talk to and the hardest to trust. Warm on the phone, quick to apologize, careful never to actually answer the specific question of where the guest payments went after she collected them. "I just handle check-ins," she said. "You'd have to ask Luke about the money side." Round and round it went, each family member gesturing toward the next, no single person willing to claim the center of the arrangement, and Jola began to understand that this diffusion was not accidental. A scheme with no single author is a scheme no single person can be blamed for, and somewhere in that family, someone had understood that principle very well. There was one person she had not yet spoken to, Jeremiah's Aunt Sylvia, his father's older sister, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman who had said almost nothing at every family gathering Jola could remember, and who, Jola realized, flipping back through 9-year-old memories, had been the one who'd first told her about the Solmar Bay listing, all those years ago, before Jola had ever met Jeremiah at all. Sylvia had sold her the house. The realization arrived quietly, the way the most important ones often do, not as a thunderclap, but as a small, cold recalibration, the kind that makes you replay a decade of conversations in a new light. Sylvia had been a real estate agent back then, semi-retired now, and she had walked Jola through that first showing 9 years ago with the brisk competence of someone who knew exactly what a young single woman building a business needed to hear to feel confident making a large decision alone. Sylvia had handled the closing. Sylvia had watched Jola sign her name on the deed with her own hand. And Sylvia had never once, in 9 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, mentioned any of that to anyone. Jola sat with that fact for a long time on the evening she pieced it together, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the shape of the betrayal shift beneath her, the way a house's foundation shifts, when you finally understand it was never built quite level to begin with. Somewhere in this family, someone had always known the truth, which meant the question was no longer, why does the family believe this house belongs to them? The question was, who had let them keep believing it? A house does not become shared property because a family decides it should be. But a family can spend a very long time behaving as though decision were the same as deed, and it takes an uncomfortable kind of courage to be the one who finally says otherwise. Jola did not confront Sylvia that week. She did something instead that surprised even her. She called Johnson Adeyemi, an attorney she had worked with twice on commercial staging contracts, a man whose entire professional temperament ran toward patience and precision, and asked him a single question over the phone. "If I own a property outright, and my husband's family has been renting it out without my knowledge for over a year," she said, keeping her voice level, What would you need from me to find out exactly how much money has changed hands and where it went?" Johnson didn't ask her to calm down. He didn't ask her if she was sure she wanted to go down this road. He asked her, simply, whether she had access to her own bank records, her deed, and as many of the booking platform's communications as she could gather. "Bring me everything you have," he said. "And Jola, don't tell them you've called a lawyer yet, not until we know what we're actually looking at." She hung up the phone and stood for a long moment on her own back porch, looking out at a beach house that had, for 14 months, belonged to strangers as much as it had belonged to her. The tide was coming in, slow and unbothered, the way it had every evening for 9 years, indifferent to the fact that everything in her life had just quietly, irrevocably, begun to change. Johnson's office was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and afternoon light, and Jola arrived the following Monday with a banker's box of printed statements, screenshots, and a manila folder containing the single most important document in the entire matter, a certified copy of the property deed, her name printed alone beneath the county seal, dated 9 years and 4 months earlier. Johnson read through it methodically, the way she imagined he read everything, without rushing toward conclusions, without performing outrage on her behalf, simply building an accurate picture 1 page at a time. "Sole ownership," he said finally, tapping the deed. "No joint tenancy, no transfer on marriage. Nothing added or amended since the original purchase. Legally, this has never been anything but yours." Then how did they get away with this for 14 months? Because ownership and access aren't the same thing, and most families never have to learn the difference. He pulled the printed listing toward him, scanning the review dates. "The listing's been active for 14 months, but I'd bet money the family's use of this property goes back further than that. They just weren't charging for it before. Which tells me something changed roughly 14 months ago. Some reason they suddenly needed this to start generating income. That question, what changed, became the center of the next 3 weeks. It was Miranda, of all people, who found the thread that pulled the rest of it loose. She had gone with Jola to a mutual friend's dinner party, the kind of gathering where Jeremiah's extended world occasionally overlapped with Jola's own, and had come away with a piece of gossip so ordinary that Jola almost dismissed it. Jeremiah's trucking company, the one he'd half inherited from his father, had lost its largest contract 14 months earlier, when a competitor undercut their bid on a regional distribution deal. 14 months. Jola sat with her coffee going cold, a posture that was becoming familiar to her, and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding. Jeremiah had never told her the business was struggling. He had mentioned, in the vague way he mentioned most things he didn't want to discuss further, that things were a little tight, but he had never once used the word struggling, never once suggested that tight might mean anything close to what she was beginning to suspect. She asked Johnson to pull whatever public records existed on Crestline Freight, the trucking company Jeremiah co-owned with a business partner. What came back, over the following days, painted a picture far more precise than Jeremiah had ever painted for her himself. A company that had taken out a private loan 11 months earlier, at a rate high enough to suggest a lender who saw real risk in the deal, secured in part by a personal guarantee from Jeremiah, and, more troublingly, by a letter of projected supplemental income that the loan file listed as coming from family real estate holdings. Family real estate holdings. There was only one property that could possibly mean. Money has a way of exposing exactly what love has been quietly hiding. A marriage can survive a great many disagreements. It survives far fewer discoveries that someone you trusted was counting on you without ever telling you they were counting on anything at all. The confrontation with Jeremiah, when it came, was not the shouting match either of them might have expected from years of watching other people's marriages fall apart on television. It happened at their own kitchen table, the loan documents spread between them, like evidence at a trial neither of them had wanted to attend. "You used the beach house as collateral," she said, not as a question. "Not collateral, projected income. It's different." He wouldn't look at her directly, staring instead at the papers as though they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. "The bank wanted to see I had another income stream besides the business, something steady, in case things stayed slow. My mom said the rental could show that. I didn't think. You didn't think I'd find out, or you didn't think it mattered that it was mine. Both, he admitted, and the honesty of that single word landed harder than any excuse would have. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself once the business stabilized, I'd tell you everything, and it would all just be a story we laughed about later. 14 months isn't temporary, Jeremiah. 14 months is a decision you made, over and over, every single month, not to tell me. He had no answer for that. There wasn't one that would have satisfied either of them. If viewers have made it this far, they already understand this isn't the kind of family drama that resolves in a single confrontation. The real betrayals are rarely the ones that announce themselves loudly. They're the quiet, repeated choices, made month after month, by people who convince themselves that silence isn't the same as lying. That's the kind of unraveling Milan Folktales exists to tell. If you've been sitting with this story so far, go ahead and subscribe before the next discovery, because the deed was never going to be where this one ended. What Jeremiah had not told her, what he did not in fact fully know himself, was the deeper history Johnson uncovered the following week, buried in 9-year-old paperwork that Jola herself had signed and long since forgotten. A modest short-term loan, $5,000, that Deborah had extended to Jola in the final anxious weeks before the beach house closing, when a delay in a client's payment had briefly left Jola short of her down payment by an amount that felt, at 29, catastrophically large. Jola had repaid every cent within 4 months. She remembered writing the final check at Deborah's own kitchen table, remembered Deborah's warm, approving smile as she'd tucked it into her purse. What Jola had not remembered, what surfaced only now, in a photocopy Johnson had requested from the county records office as part of the original closing file, was a single handwritten line Deborah had insisted on adding to the informal loan agreement at the time, more sentiment than contract. In appreciation, the family shall always be welcome to enjoy the Solmar property as one of our own. Jola had signed it without a second thought. She had been 29, grateful, eager to smooth over any awkwardness with the woman who would soon become her mother-in-law. She had understood it, at the time and for 9 years afterward, exactly the way it was clearly intended in the moment, as a gracious invitation to visit, nothing more. Deborah, it seemed, had understood it as something else entirely, or had chosen to, once it became useful. This was the second revelation, and it changed the shape of everything. Someone in that family had known, with total legal clarity, that the beach house belonged to Jola alone, because Deborah herself had drafted the very line she now used to justify treating it otherwise. It was not ignorance. It had never been ignorance. It was a decade-long decision to misread a kindness as a permanent right, made by the one person in the family with every reason to know better. And Sylvia, quiet, watchful Sylvia, who had handled the original closing and witnessed Jola's signature on both documents, had said nothing, for 9 years, while that misreading calcified into family fact. Why would she stay silent that long? Jola asked Johnson, genuinely bewildered. People rarely correct a story that's working in their family's favor, Johnson said, especially not when correcting it means becoming the person who ruins Thanksgiving. For a while, Jola let herself believe the simplest version of the story, that Jeremiah was the architect of all of it, a man who had quietly engineered his own family's access to her property to bail out a business he'd been too proud to admit was failing. It was, in some ways, the easiest theory to sit with, because it gave the betrayal a single face. But the more Johnson's investigation uncovered, the less that theory held. Jeremiah had not created the rental listing. Luke and Chloe had, working from Deborah's long-standing insistence that the family had a right to the property, months before Jeremiah's business trouble had even begun. Jeremiah had not orchestrated the loan's misleading income letter. His business partner had drafted it, working from information Deborah supplied about the rental's monthly earnings, information Jeremiah had signed off on without asking too many questions, because asking questions would have meant confronting what his family had built without his wife's knowledge, and admitting, to himself, that he had let it happen. He was not the mastermind. He was something almost worse, in its own quiet way. The man who had known enough to stop it, and had chosen, month after month, the comfort of his family's approval, and his business's survival over his wife's trust. "That doesn't make him innocent," Jola said, once Johnson laid it out plainly. "It just means everyone gets to say it wasn't really their fault. It usually works that way," Johnson said, "until someone makes them answer for it individually instead of collectively." The third revelation surfaced almost by accident. In a stack of bank statements Johnson had subpoenaed from the shared account Luke used to manage the rental proceeds. Buried among ordinary cleaning service payments and utility transfers was a recurring monthly transfer to Crestline Freight's business account, not once, not twice, but 11 consecutive months, each one timed within days of Jeremiah's loan payment coming due. It was not merely that the family had used the projected rental income to secure Jeremiah's loan. They had been actively funneling the real rental income directly into his business account each month, quietly, consistently, to make sure the projection on paper matched an actual deposit history, because a lender who looked closely enough might have asked to verify the family real estate holdings' income was real, and someone in that family had understood exactly how thin that fabrication would look under scrutiny. Someone had been managing that transfer schedule with real care. The statements traced back to a single authorized signer on the account. It was Sylvia. People who spend years quietly managing other people's blind spots eventually discover that the paperwork remembers everything, even when the family agrees to forget. Jola drove to Sylvia's house alone, on a gray Thursday afternoon, without calling first. She found her aunt-in-law in the garden, pruning a rose bush with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, and Sylvia did not seem surprised to see her, only tired, in the particular way of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation they knew was inevitable. "I sold you that house," Sylvia said, before Jola could ask a single question. "I watched you sign your name on that deed, 9 years ago, alone, no one else's name on it. I have known, every single day since, exactly whose house that is." "Then why let it go this far?" Sylvia set down her shears. "Because Deborah asked me to manage the transfers, and I told myself it was temporary, and because I have spent 40 years in this family, learning that the quietest way to survive it is never to be the one who says the uncomfortable true thing out loud." She looked at Jola directly, and there was no defiance in it, only a plain, weary honesty. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong the whole time. Knowing something is wrong, and having the courage to say so out loud in front of your own family, are two very different things. Jola, I hope you never have to learn that the hard way yourself." It was, in its own way, the most honest thing anyone in Jeremiah's family had said to her in 14 months. Johnson filed the paperwork on a bright Tuesday morning in early summer, a civil action seeking an accounting of all rental income collected from the Solmar Bay property over the preceding 14 months, damages for unauthorized use, and a formal injunction barring any further rental activity without Jola's written consent. It was not, he reminded her more than once, an attempt to punish everyone equally. It was an attempt to establish, in a manner no family conversation ever could, precisely what had happened and precisely who bore responsibility for each part of it. "We're not going for spectacle," he told her, the week before the hearing. "Judges don't reward spectacle. We're going for a record so clear no one in that room can keep pretending the story is complicated." The hearing, when it came, was quieter than Jola had imagined a courtroom could be. There was no shouting, no dramatic reveal delivered with a flourish. There was Johnson, calm and methodical, walking the court through 9 years of documents. The original deed, the handwritten loan agreement with its single fateful line about family welcome, the rental listing with its 14 months of reviews, the bank statements tracing 11 consecutive transfers from a shared account to Crestline Freight. Deborah, called to testify, maintained for as long as she could that the family had always believed they held some rightful claim to the property, until Johnson produced her own handwriting, the original loan note in her own hand, and asked her, plainly, whether she had ever seen the deed that named Jola as sole owner. "I saw it at the closing," Deborah admitted finally, quietly, the fight going out of her voice for the first time in 14 months. "Sylvia showed all of us, years ago, when she handled the sale. I suppose I decided it didn't matter as much as family did." It was the contradiction Johnson had been building toward from the beginning. The moment the family's shared story of innocent misunderstanding collapsed into something closer to the truth, not confusion, but a long, quiet agreement among several people to behave as though a fact they all knew simply wasn't so. Jeremiah's testimony was the hardest for Jola to sit through, not because he lied, but because he didn't. He admitted, without excuse, that he had known the rental income was funding his loan's income projection. He admitted he had never told her, because telling her would have meant admitting the business was failing and his family was covering for him in ways he was too ashamed to explain. He admitted, when Johnson asked him directly, that he had chosen, not once, but every month, for 14 months, his family's comfort and his own pride over his wife's right to know what was happening in her own home. "I kept telling myself I'd fix it before she found out," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, in a way that would have moved Jola deeply, once, in an earlier version of their marriage. "I understand now that the fixing was supposed to happen the moment I found out myself, not the moment it became convenient." It was, Jola thought, watching him from across the courtroom, the first fully honest sentence her husband had spoken about any of it. If you've stayed with this story through the deed, the loan, and everything Sylvia knew and never said, you already understand why family secrets like this one always find their way to the surface eventually. That's the kind of unraveling Milan Folktales was built to tell, quietly, patiently, one true thing at a time. If this is the kind of story that keeps you watching until the very end, you know what to do before we get there. The judge's ruling, delivered 3 weeks later, was neither dramatic nor especially lengthy, and it was, in its plainness, more satisfying than any courtroom speech could have been. The deed stood as it always had, sole ownership, uncontested, never legally in question. The court ordered a full accounting and return of the rental income collected over the 14-month period, apportioned according to each family member's role and knowledge. Deborah and Sylvia, who had both known the true ownership and participated in concealing it, bore the largest share of financial responsibility. Luke and Chloe, who had managed logistics without full knowledge of the loan scheme, a smaller share. Emmanuel, the cousin who had handled maintenance and genuinely believed the family held some legitimate right to the property, was released from financial liability entirely on the court's finding that he had acted in good faith on false information others had given him. The injunction was granted without argument. The listing came down within the hour, the reviews and photographs of Jola's own kitchen disappearing from the internet as quietly as they had first appeared on it. Jeremiah faced no criminal penalty. There had been no fraud rising to that level, Johnson explained. Only a civil failure to disclose and a marriage-sized breach of trust that no court could properly measure. But the loan itself came under separate scrutiny from Crestline Freight's lender, once the misleading income letter came to light, and Jeremiah spent the following months renegotiating terms he could actually stand behind honestly, without his wife's silence propping up numbers that had never been entirely true. The family did not fracture all at once, the way families in dramatic stories are supposed to. It came apart slowly, the way most real things do. Deborah calling less often, her calls, when they came, carrying an unfamiliar carefulness. Luke and Chloe both reaching out separately, in the months that followed, with apologies that sounded, for the first time, less like excuses, and more like an honest reckoning with what they'd allowed themselves to believe was fine. Emmanuel remained the one relationship that survived mostly intact, visiting the beach house once more, months later, with Jola's explicit invitation this time, helping her repaint the porch railing in comfortable silence. Sylvia sent a single letter, handwritten, several weeks after the ruling. It said, in part, that she hoped Jola would forgive her eventually, though she understood if she never did, and that she had spent 40 years learning the wrong lesson about what keeping peace in a family was actually supposed to cost a person. Jola kept the letter. She did not yet know what she felt about it. Some betrayals, she was learning, did not resolve into forgiveness or anger cleanly. They simply became part of the permanent shape of a person's understanding of who they could trust, and how much. She and Jeremiah separated 4 months after the ruling, not in anger, but in the quiet recognition that trust, once broken this specifically, and for this long, could not simply be reassembled by good intentions going forward. He did not fight the separation. He told her, the last time they spoke as a married couple, that he understood now what Johnson had meant in that courtroom, that the fixing was supposed to happen the moment he found out, not the moment it became convenient, and that he was sorry it had taken losing her to finally understand the difference. A family name does not create a property title. A kindness extended once does not become a permanent claim, no matter how many years pass before anyone corrects the record. And a marriage cannot survive on one partner's silence, being mistaken for the other partner's peace. Being generous with the people you love does not obligate you to let them mistake your generosity for their right. The people who call themselves family are sometimes the ones most practiced at testing exactly how far your boundaries bend before you notice they've been crossed entirely. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all, the person who benefits most from your silence is rarely the person working hardest to keep you silent. Sometimes it is simply the person who has learned that your patience makes their comfort easier. She returned to the beach house alone on a Sunday evening in early autumn, nearly a year after that first strange text message had arrived in her kitchen. The porch railing Emmanuel had helped her repaint, held its color well against the fading light. The outdoor shower, the one detail from that very first stranger's message that had started all of it, stood exactly where it always had, unremarkable, hers. There were no guests, no family cars in the gravel drive, no calendar of bookings dictating who had claim to which weekend, just Jola, standing on her own porch, watching the tide come in the way it had every evening for 9 years, indifferent, as it always had been, to everything that had changed around it. She thought about the woman who had bought this house at 29, proud and a little frightened, signing her name alone on a deed she'd fought hard to be able to sign. She thought about how long it had taken her to understand that ownership was never the thing anyone had actually needed to prove. It had been hers, uncontested, the entire time. What she had needed to learn, the long and painful way, was that having the right to something and having the courage to defend it were two entirely different inheritances, and that only one of them could be taken from her by anyone else's quiet, patient assumption that she never would. The house did not feel like a battlefield anymore. It did not feel like family, either. Not the way it once had. Not the version of family that had required her silence to function. It felt, standing there in the last gold light of the evening, like something simpler and far more valuable than either of those things had ever been. It felt like hers, fully, finally, without anyone else's name quietly attached to what it meant. Some people spend years believing that closeness gives them the right to take. It is only the ones willing to stand quietly, patiently, and finally say otherwise, who ever get to find.